never believed in monsters until one started killing my livestock. What I'm about to share happened on my farm in northern Michigan, where I've raised cattle and chickens for the past 15 years. The attacks began 3 years ago, and what I captured on my trail camera still gives me nightmares. This is my story, and the proof is real. It was a cold February morning when I found the first victim. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my usual rounds to check on the animals. Everything seemed normal until I reached the chicken coop. The door hung open, swaying in the winter wind. Inside, feathers covered the floor like fallen snow, and 3 of my best hens were missing. At first, I blamed a fox or coyote. We get plenty of them around here, especially in winter when food gets scarce. But something felt wrong. The chicken wire had been torn apart with incredible force, twisted metal jutting out like broken bones. No fox could do that kind of damage. Even a coyote would struggle to bend thick gauge wire that way. I spent the morning fixing the coop and reinforcing the wire mesh. The missing chickens were a loss I could handle, but I couldn't afford to lose more. These animals were my livelihood, and every death hit my bank account hard. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time I lost 5 chickens, and the damage was worse. The wooden frame of the coop had deep scratches gouged into it, marks that looked almost like claw marks, but far too large for any local predator. The scratches went deep into the wood, at least an inch in some places. I ran my fingers along the gouges, feeling the splintered edges. Whatever made these marks had serious strength behind it. I called the local game warden, hoping he might have some insight into what kind of animal could cause this damage. He came out the next day, a tired-looking man in his 50s who had seen plenty of predator attacks over the years. He walked around the coop, examined the scratches, and shook his head. "Never seen anything quite like this," he admitted. "Could be a bear, but they're hibernating this time of year. Might be a really aggressive coyote, or maybe someone's dog got loose." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a dog. The damage was too systematic, too purposeful. Dogs kill for food or territory, but they don't typically tear apart structures with this kind of precision. This felt different, almost calculated. Over the next 6 months, the attacks continued every few weeks, always at night, always when the weather was overcast or stormy. The creature seemed to prefer darkness and bad weather, times when visibility was low and sounds were muffled by wind or rain. The pattern was always the same. I would wake up in the morning to find damaged fencing, torn chicken wire, or broken wooden planks. A few animals would be missing, never more than 2 or 3 at a time. Sometimes I found partial remains scattered around the farm, but never enough to identify what kind of predator was responsible. In April, it went after my cattle for the first time. I found the young bull in the far pasture about a quarter mile from the barn. The sight made my stomach turn. The animal had been killed with incredible violence, its throat torn open and chunks of flesh missing from its hindquarters. But what disturbed me most was how clean the kill was. There were no signs of a struggle, no trampled grass or broken fence posts. It was as if something had overpowered a 1,200-pound bull without any effort at all. The financial loss was devastating. That bull was worth $3,000, money I couldn't afford to lose. But the emotional impact was worse. I had raised that animal from a calf, watched it grow strong and healthy. To see it butchered like that filled me with a rage I had never felt before. I spent that entire day walking the property, looking for tracks or any sign of what had killed my bull. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for preserving footprints. I found plenty of cow tracks, some deer prints, and my own boot marks from earlier visits to the pasture. But I also found something else. Near the bull's body, pressed deep into the muddy ground, was a single footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly the size and shape of a large dog's paw, but the proportions were all wrong. The print was longer and narrower than any dog track I knew, with claw marks extending well beyond the pad impressions. Most disturbing of all, the depth of the print suggested whatever made it was extremely heavy, far heavier than any dog or wolf. I took photos of the print with my phone, measuring it against my boot for scale. The track was almost 8 inches long and nearly 6 inches wide. I had been around animals my entire life, had tracked deer and other game since I was a boy, but I'd never seen anything like this print. After losing the bull, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't afford to keep losing animals, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. I drove into town and bought 4 trail cameras, the kind hunters use to monitor deer movements. They weren't cheap, but they were my best hope of identifying the predator. I spent an entire weekend installing the cameras around the farm. 2 went near the chicken coop, positioned to cover different angles of approach. The 3rd camera went near the cattle pasture where I had found the bull. The 4th I placed along a game trail that ran through the woods behind my property. Figuring whatever was doing, this might use the same path repeatedly. The cameras were motion activated with infrared night vision. If anything larger than a squirrel moved within their range, they would snap a photo and record the date and time. I checked the SD cards every few days, hoping to finally get a clear look at my tormentor. For 2 months, the cameras captured nothing but deer, raccoons, and the occasional fox. I started to wonder if the creature had moved on, or if maybe the cameras themselves were deterring it. Some animals can sense the infrared flash and avoid areas where cameras are placed. Then, in late June, the attacks resumed. I lost 3 more chickens, and this time the damage to the coop was even more severe. Entire sections of wooden planking had been ripped away, and the metal hinges on the door were bent beyond repair. It was as if something had grabbed the structure and twisted it apart with its bare hands. The force required would have been enormous, far beyond what any normal animal could produce. But this time, I had hope. One of the cameras was positioned perfectly to capture whatever had done this damage. I hurried to check the SD card, my hands shaking with anticipation as I loaded the files onto my computer. Most of the photos showed nothing unusual: a raccoon sniffing around the coop at 2:47 a.m., a barn cat walking past at 4:13 a.m. Then, at 3:22 a.m., sandwiched between the innocuous wildlife photos, was an image that changed everything. The trail camera had captured something that defied explanation. In the greenish glow of the infrared flash, a figure stood near the chicken coop. At first glance, it looked almost human, standing upright on 2 legs with long arms hanging at its sides. But the proportions were all wrong, and the features were clearly not human. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, with a muscular build and long, powerful limbs. Its body was covered in dark fur or hair, and its head was elongated, almost canine in shape. The eyes reflected the camera flash with an eerie, bright glow, and I could make out what appeared to be a snout and pointed ears. Most unsettling of all were the hands. They looked almost human in structure, with long fingers and opposable thumbs, but they ended in curved claws that caught the light of the camera flash. These were the hands that had torn apart my chicken coop, the claws that had left those deep gouges in the wooden planks. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a bear or a wolf or any known animal. This was something else entirely, something that walked upright like a man but had the features of a predatory animal. The local legends came flooding back to me, stories I had heard as a child about the Michigan Dogman, a creature that was said to roam the forests of the Great Lakes region. I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, campfire tales meant to scare children. But here was photographic evidence that something matching those descriptions was real, and it had been terrorizing my farm for months. The next morning, I called the game warden again. This time I had proof, clear photographic evidence of what had been killing my livestock. I was excited, vindicated, and certain that someone in authority would finally take my situation seriously. The warden arrived that afternoon, bringing a colleague from the Department of Natural Resources. I showed them the damaged chicken coop, pointed out the claw marks in the wood, and then proudly displayed the trail camera photo on my laptop screen. Their reaction was not what I had expected. The two men looked at the photo, then at each other, then back at me with expressions of barely concealed annoyance. The game warden shook his head and closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "You really think we're going to fall for this?" he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "This is obviously fake. You can make anything look real with Photoshop these days." I protested, tried to explain that I wouldn't know how to fake such a photo even if I wanted to, but they weren't listening. They had made up their minds before I even showed them the evidence. To them, I was just another attention-seeking farmer trying to get sympathy for normal predator losses. "Look," the DNR officer said, "we understand you've had some livestock losses and we're sympathetic to that. But filing false reports and creating fake evidence is a serious matter. We could charge you with interfering with a wildlife investigation." The game warden nodded. "We're going to let this slide with a warning and a fine this time. But if you contact us again with more of these fantasy stories, there will be consequences." They wrote me a citation for filing a false report, a $300 fine that felt like a slap in the face. I watched them drive away, feeling more alone and helpless than I had ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to help me had not only dismissed my evidence, but punished me for bringing it to their attention. That night, I realized I was truly on my own. If the authorities wouldn't help me, I would have to protect my animals myself. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into fortifying the farm with an obsession that bordered on mania. I couldn't afford to lose any more livestock, both financially and emotionally. I started with the chicken coop, completely rebuilding it with pressure-treated lumber and reinforcing every joint with metal brackets. Instead of chicken wire, I installed heavy-gauge welded mesh that would require bolt cutters to breach. The door got 3 separate locks and a metal frame that could withstand significant force. Around the coop, I built a secondary fence made of 8-foot-tall posts with razor wire along the top. It looked like something you might see around a prison, but I didn't care about appearances anymore. I only cared about keeping my animals safe. The cattle presented a bigger challenge. I couldn't build a fortress around an entire pasture, but I could make it harder for predators to approach undetected. I cleared all the brush and small trees within 50 yards of the fence line, eliminating hiding spots. Motion sensor floodlights went up every 100 feet, turning night into day whenever something large moved near the pasture. I also invested in an electric fence system, running hot wire along the top and bottom of the existing fence post. The voltage was set high enough to deter any animal or anything else that might try to climb over or dig under the barrier. For weeks, my modifications seemed to work. The attacks stopped, and I began to hope that maybe I had finally solved the problem. The creature, whatever it was, had apparently decided my farm was too well defended and moved on to easier targets. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. On a humid August night, I was awakened by the sound of panicked animals. The chickens were making a tremendous racket, and I could hear the cattle bellowing in distress from the far pasture. I grabbed my rifle from the bedroom closet and rushed outside, my heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. The scene that greeted me was devastating. Despite all my reinforcements, the creature had somehow breached the chicken coop defenses. The welded mesh had been torn apart like tissue paper, and the metal door frame was twisted into an unrecognizable shape. 3 chickens were missing, and the survivors huddled in the corner, too terrified to make a sound. But the real shock came when I checked the cattle pasture. One of my cows lay dead near the fence line, its throat torn open in the same brutal manner as the bull months earlier. The electric fence had been ripped down, the hot wire snapped and coiled on the ground like dead snakes. What disturbed me most was how easily all my defenses had been overcome. Months of work and thousands of dollars in materials had been destroyed in a single night. The creature had adapted to my countermeasures and found ways around every obstacle I had put in its path. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the destruction of my efforts, I felt a crushing sense of defeat. This wasn't just about losing livestock anymore. This was about being systematically terrorized by something that seemed to take pleasure in demonstrating its superiority over my attempts at defense. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my porch with the rifle in my lap, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made me jump. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside and leave my remaining animals unprotected. 3 nights later, I heard the familiar sounds of distressed animals coming from the pasture. This time, I was ready. I had been sleeping in my clothes with the rifle beside the bed, and I was outside within seconds of hearing the first bellows of panic from the cattle. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see across the pasture without needing a flashlight. I moved carefully along the fence line, trying to spot whatever had spooked the animals. The cows had gathered in a tight group near the barn, all facing toward the far end of the pasture where the property bordered the woods. Then I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by a cluster of thick bushes, was a dark figure. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, I could tell it was tall and upright, moving with a fluid grace that was both human and animal-like. This was the creature from the trail camera photo, the thing that had been terrorizing my farm for months. My hands shook as I raised the rifle and peered through the scope. The figure was mostly in shadow, but I could make out enough detail to confirm what I was seeing. The elongated head, the powerful build, the way it moved on 2 legs but maintained a predatory crouch. This was no bear or wolf or any other normal animal. I took a deep breath, steadied my aim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, shattering the night silence. Through the scope, I saw the figure jerk and stumble backward into the trees. A sound echoed across the pasture, a howl of pain and rage that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was part wolf, part dog, but with an almost human quality that made my blood run cold. I had hit it. After months of frustration and helplessness, I had finally struck back at my tormentor. But my moment of triumph was short-lived. As the echoes of the howl faded, I realized what I might have done. If this creature was part of a pack, if there were others like it in the woods, I had just declared war on something far more dangerous than a simple predator. I stayed outside for the rest of the night, rifle ready, waiting for retaliation that never came. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me spin toward the sound, finger on the trigger. I expected to see glowing eyes emerging from the darkness, expected to hear the sound of multiple creatures moving through the underbrush. But the woods remained silent. The next morning, I walked out to where the creature had been standing when I took the shot. The area was thick with brambles and fallen logs, making it difficult to search thoroughly, but I was determined to find some evidence of what had happened. Near a large oak tree, about 20 feet from where I remembered seeing the figure, I found what I was looking for. Dark stains on the bark and scattered drops in the fallen leaves below. Blood, definitely blood, and quite a bit of it. I followed the blood trail deeper into the woods, marking my path with strips of orange surveyor's tape so I wouldn't get lost. The trail was easy to follow at first, with regular drops and smears on trees and bushes. Whatever I had hit was bleeding heavily and apparently struggling to move through the dense undergrowth. The trail led roughly northeast, toward a section of state forest that bordered my property. I had hunted in these woods many times over the years, but I had never ventured very deep into this particular area. The terrain was rough, full of ravines and thick stands of cedar that made travel difficult. After following the blood trail for about half a mile, it suddenly stopped. I searched the area carefully, looking for any sign that the wounded creature had continued in a different direction, but found nothing. It was as if whatever I had shot had simply vanished. Near the spot where the trail ended, I found something interesting. Scratched into the bark of a large maple tree were deep claw marks, fresh one that hadn't been there on my previous hunting trips through this area. The marks were similar to what I had found around my chicken coop, but these seemed different somehow, more frantic, more desperate. I also found tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the low branches of several bushes. The hair was unlike anything I had seen before, thicker and coarser than deer hair, but not quite like the fur of any domestic animal. I collected several samples, wrapping them carefully in plastic bags for later examination. But despite the blood, the claw marks, and the hair samples, I found no body. Whatever I had shot was wounded, possibly seriously, but it had survived and apparently escaped deeper into the forest. From that night forward, the attack stopped completely. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of the creature. My remaining livestock went about their business undisturbed, and I began to sleep through the night again without being awakened by sounds of panic from the barn or pasture. The trail cameras I had positioned around the farm continued to snap photos of the usual wildlife, but there were no more mysterious figures, no more glowing eyes in the darkness. It was as if the creature had simply vanished from the area entirely. I should have been relieved, and part of me was. The financial losses had stopped, and I no longer lived in constant fear of what I might find each morning when I went to check on the animals. But the abrupt end to the attacks raised more questions than it answered. Had I killed the creature after all, and it had simply crawled off somewhere to die? The amount of blood I had found suggested a serious wound, possibly fatal. But if it had died, where was the body? I had searched the area thoroughly and found no trace of remains. Maybe the creature had been part of a pack, and the others had carried off their wounded or dead companion. That would explain the sudden disappearance of evidence, but it raised the terrifying possibility that there were more of these things in the woods around my farm. Or perhaps I had wounded it badly enough that it decided to leave the area entirely, seeking easier hunting grounds where it wouldn't face armed resistance. This seemed like the most logical explanation, but it also implied a level of intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Months have passed since that night, and I still have no answers. The creature has never returned, and I have never found any conclusive evidence of what happened to it. The hair samples I collected were examined by a veterinarian friend, but he couldn't identify the species. The blood trail photos I took have been studied by wildlife biologists who dismiss them as evidence of a wounded deer or bear, despite my insistence that the circumstances were different. I continue to maintain the defenses I built around my farm, though they no longer seem necessary. The motion sensor lights still flood the property with artificial daylight whenever anything large moves near the buildings. The reinforced fencing remains in place, and I still sleep with the rifle within easy reach. The trail cameras continue to document the normal wildlife that moves through my property at night. Deer, raccoons, foxes, and the occasional black bear all make appearances in the photos, but none of the mysterious figures that once haunted my farm. Sometimes, usually on dark, stormy nights when the wind howls through the trees, I find myself wondering if the creature is still out there somewhere. Maybe it's watching from the deep woods, waiting for me to let my guard down. Maybe it's moved on to terrorize some other unfortunate farmer. Or maybe it died from its wound in some remote corner of the forest, and its bones are slowly being scattered by scavengers. I may never know the truth about what happened that night, or what the creature really was. The photograph from my trail camera remains the only clear evidence I have that any of this actually occurred. Local authorities continue to dismiss it as a hoax, and most people who see it assume it's some kind of digital manipulation. But I know what I saw, and I know what I experienced during those terrifying months. The Michigan Dogman, or whatever you want to call it, is real. I have the scars on my bank account and the reinforced buildings on my farm to prove it. The attacks have stopped, but the memory remains. Every time I walk across my property at night, every time I hear an unexplained sound from the woods, I remember those glowing eyes staring back at me through the camera lens. I remember the devastating strength that could tear apart metal fencing like paper, and the intelligence that adapted to every defensive measure I implemented. The trail camera image remains the centerpiece of my story, the one piece of evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. I've studied it countless times, examining every detail for clues about the creature's nature and origins. The figure in the photo is clearly not human, despite its upright posture and roughly human proportions. The head is too elongated, the limbs too long, and the overall build too muscular for any person. The reflective eyes and visible fangs mark it as a predator, something designed by nature or evolution to hunt and kill. But it's also not entirely animal. The way it stands, the structure of its hands, and the apparent intelligence behind its attacks suggests something that bridges the gap between human and beast. This is what makes the creature so unsettling, so difficult to categorize or understand. Wildlife experts who have reluctantly examined the photo point out various details they claim prove it's fake. The lighting is wrong, they say, or the proportions don't match any known animal. But they can never explain exactly how such a convincing fake might have been created, especially by someone with no training in digital manipulation. I've offered to let forensic experts examine the original SD card from the trail camera, hoping that technical analysis might prove the authenticity of the image. So far, no one has taken me up on the offer. It seems that most people would rather dismiss the evidence than confront the possibility that something like this might actually exist. My experience is not unique. Over the years, I've connected with other farmers and rural residents throughout Michigan who have reported similar encounters. The details vary, but the core elements remain consistent. A large, upright creature with canine features that preys on livestock and seems to possess human-like intelligence. Most of these people have never reported their experiences to authorities, having learned from cases like mine that official response ranges from dismissive to hostile. Instead, they've formed an informal network sharing information and strategies for protecting their property and animals. What emerges from these collective accounts is a picture of a phenomenon that has been occurring throughout the Great Lakes region for decades, possibly much longer. The creatures, whatever they are, seem to be territorial and generally solitary, which might explain why encounters are relatively rare despite the large number of rural properties in their apparent range. The attacks follow predictable patterns. They target easy prey like chickens and young livestock. They prefer to operate under cover of darkness and bad weather, and they seem to be deterred by bright lights and human activity. But they also demonstrate problem-solving abilities that go far beyond normal animal behavior, adapting their tactics when faced with new defensive measures. I've spent countless hours researching possible explanations for what I experienced on my farm. The theories range from the scientific to the supernatural, and none of them provide completely satisfying answers. Some researchers suggest that creatures like the Michigan Dogman might be surviving members of an unknown species, perhaps a remnant population of prehistoric predators that managed to avoid extinction by retreating to remote wilderness areas. This would explain their apparent intelligence and their ability to avoid human detection for so long. Others propose that these creatures might be the result of modern genetic anomalies, animals that have undergone unusual mutations due to environmental factors or disease. While this might account for their unusual characteristics, it doesn't explain the consistent reports that span multiple generations. The supernatural explanations are even more varied, ranging from shape-shifting entities to interdimensional visitors. While these theories cannot be scientifically tested, they do attempt to address the seemingly impossible aspects of encounters like mine, such as the creature's ability to appear and disappear without leaving traces. Personally, I lean toward the theory that these are flesh and blood animals, probably mammals, that have evolved or adapted in ways that allow them to thrive in the margins of human civilization. Their intelligence and adaptability would be survival traits, allowing them to exploit human resources while avoiding direct confrontation with our superior numbers and technology. The months of terror I experienced have left permanent changes in how I view my property and my place in the natural world. I used to feel like the master of my small domain, confident in my ability to protect my animals and maintain my way of life. Now I understand that I am just another species sharing this land with things I don't fully understand. The financial losses were significant, but the psychological impact has been even greater. I find myself constantly vigilant, always listening for sounds that might indicate the return of my tormentor. Even during daylight hours when logic tells me I am safe, I catch myself scanning the tree line for signs of movement. My relationship with local authorities has been permanently damaged by their dismissive response to my evidence. I no longer trust that help will come if I need it, and I've learned to rely entirely on my own resources for protection. This isolation is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire experience. But there have been positive changes as well. I've become more aware of the wildlife that shares my property, more respectful of the wilderness that surrounds my farm. I've also connected with a community of people who have had similar experiences, and there is comfort in knowing that I am not alone in facing the unknown. 3 years have passed since the attacks began, and more than a year since they ended. I continue to farm the same land, raise the same animals, and maintain the same routines that have defined my life for decades. But everything is different now, colored by the knowledge that there are things in the world that defy easy explanation. The creature that terrorized my farm may be gone, but it has left an indelible mark on my understanding of reality. I know that somewhere in the vast forests of northern Michigan, predators roam that are not found in any biology textbook. I know that the boundary between the civilized world and the wilderness is far more porous than most people believe. I also know that most people will never believe my story, regardless of the evidence I present. The photograph from my trail camera will be dismissed as a hoax, and my account will be filed away with countless other tall tales from rural America. This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the entire experience, having lived through something extraordinary and being unable to convince others of its reality. But for those few who have had similar encounters, for those who understand that the world still holds mysteries that science has yet to explain, my story serves as both a warning and a reassurance. The creatures are real. They can be dangerous, but they can also be driven away by courage and determination. The Michigan Dogman exists. I have the photograph to prove it and the scars on my property to remember it by. Whether it will return someday, whether others like it continue to roam the forests of the Great Lakes region, I cannot say. I can only continue to live my life with the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people ever imagine. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling through the trees and the motion sensors are casting their harsh light across my fortified farm, I remember those glowing eyes staring back at me through the camera lens, and I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. For more interesting stories, check this out.